the guns for which they had at their disposal were guns like these. Now, as I said, they're old iron guns left over from the French and Indian War. Maybe old French guns, old British guns. Didn't matter. Whatever was here was used. And in fact, these guns are all iron. That is to say, a metal that's great for making cannons because in the period it's relatively cheap. It's easy to form, easy to work, and therefore it makes an ideal metal for casting guns. Yet iron could be brittle. And therefore iron guns have to be cast very, very thick. That means in comparison to guns like that made out of bronze, they're a whole lot heavier. Yet they're more reliable, and cannons like these can scream away for hours and hours on end without faltering or drooping like many of the bronze guns. Now the guns at Ticonderoga varied in size. They're all named by the weight of ball they fire. Their largest ones all the way up to 32 pounders. That's a 32-pound iron cannonball for which it fires. They have 18 pounders. They have 12s, 9s, 8s, 6s, 4s, 3s, 2s, 1.5s, and even small half-pounder guns. And by June of 1777, the biggest guns are placed right down on the water at the Jersey Redoubt. Two 18-pounders screaming away for hours during the siege. The very spot for which you drove past as you came through our admissions booth stood that redoubt. Now these guns, no matter the size, have all the same main parts. The overall tube of our gun is the cannon, and through the center of it is a bore, a hollow chamber for which we load our shot. At the very back is a vent hole or touch hole. It's a small hole inside that creates a direct connection of powder to the charge as it seeps inside of our breech. Now at the rear, it's the thickest part, known as the first reinforced. This is where the explosion starts, the pressure's the most, and therefore it has to be built up with added metal to sustain all that pressure. At the very center of the gun is our second reinforced, where it has two iron arms, known as trunnions. Notice how the bigger the part of the gun sits back behind that. That's not the center of gravity. What it allows is that cannon to swing on those iron arms and sit back. And when the cannon fires, the recoil not only goes back, but given the weight of the rear, it actually presses downward. Now the edge of the gun is our muzzle flare. Notice how it flares on out. And at the very opposite end is a small little knob known as our cascabel, allowing to move the gun up or down to change elevation. This cannon seated on a traveling carriage, quite literally moving these guns from point A to point B. But notice as we brought it out here, underneath either side of the gun are little boxes, known as shot lockers. In there is nearly 20 shot on either side. And what seats on top of those are our ammunition boxes, which carry all the ammunition we need for this gun. In fact, this is a 4-pounder. An old French gun left over from the French and Indian War. And even in that time period, it's old, cast all the way back in 1721. Now, to ask you guys, how heavy is the shot we fire from it? 4 pounds. Yeah, it's pretty easy. The answer is a 4-pound cast iron ball. Yet when they start to make up their black powder rounds to send it down range the appropriate distance, they have to create that black powder, measure it out to the right weight. All they need is 1/3 the weight of their shot in powder to send it as far as it ought to go. So how much powder do we need for this 4-pounder?
1 1/3 pound.
1 1/3 or 4/3, however you like to do your fractions, both the same thing. And it's enough powder to send it as far as it goes. Now that's pre-packaged. Might be in a paper, parchment, or wool flannel bag. Now on top of that powder goes a wad. And in artillery service here, they use an old naval trick. Ticonderoga is so tied to the water that these artillerymen are functioning things much in the same way as sailors. Now the junk wad is made up of old ropes from the rigging of ships that's rotted away. But the parts that are left behind are unfurled and tied back together into this little disc. Now that's packed on top of our powder. Top of that goes our shot. Top of that another wad ready to prime, aim, and fire. Now if the enemy gets closer than, say, 1.5 miles, which is the maximum range for this gun, and to give you guys a for instance, I want everybody to go ahead and turn around behind you. Does everybody see Mount Defiance back there? It's got the little building up on top, great American flag flying, great place for a picnic. Now that's just 3/4 of a mile away. And if we shot this 4-pounder at that mountain, not only would you have to look out on top, but you might want to be careful if you're on the other side. Now they could fire at ranges closer than that. In fact, these guns are operating at point blank. For this gun, that's 676 yards. They switch over to case shot or canister. It's now a tinned iron case filled with all the lead musket balls that break apart as the gun's fired. They may use another naval trick called grape shot, where they take 9 individual iron shot, lace them together into a porcelain bag, and send that downrange. And it's the job of these artillerymen not to do all the work of moving their guns, making their carriages. They also make all their ammunition. They work daily over at the laboratory on Mount Independence, creating the powder, the rounds, preparing them. That stores at Ticonderoga by July of 1777 included thousands and thousands of rounds. So they would be ready to hold off an attack. Now, to actually operate this gun requires special tools or implements. It's the man who works to the front right, he carries the sponge staff. This is a long wooden pole that one end has our sponge. It's a sheepskin with the fur still on, covered over a hardwood head. Now he'll dip that into water and then into the tube itself. It's that wet sponge head that helps us to extinguish any hot embers inside, but it also cools the gun down. Imagine during a siege, this gun would fire non-stop for days. And to regulate the temperature, it's a cool sponge head that's inserted inside. Now his other job is to ram home our charge. The other end is a rammer head, simply a hardwood head that allows him to pack everything on down to the breech. The man who works adjacent to him, to the front left of our gun, he loads. He carries our worm ladle. Now at one end is this ladle. It's a copper bit that's shaped much like a spoon. He uses this to load our powder inside, inserting the powder charge into that big old spoon, using copper so as not to create sparks inside an iron tube, which would be fun for nobody. Now the very other end of that is a wad hook or worm. It's a steel and iron bit curled around like a pigtail. It's inserted into the breech after we fire. It grabs hold of any burning embers, pulling them on out so we could safely reload. The man who works at the back right of the gun is our bombardier. He has the special job of handling all our powder. He also primes our piece. To actually prime our gun, he carries around his waist a tin tube box. In that box, he has little tinned quills. They're pointed on one end and filled to the top with powder. Then in one motion, he takes that pointed quill, stabs it into the vent, creates a hole inside the charge, makes a direct connection of powder. Now, if that fails, he could do the opening of the charge inside manually. He carries with him a small brass priming wire. He'll insert that into the vent, pull it on out, and put in another quill, this time made out of a goose feather, sometimes rolled up paper, still filled with that same powder. Now, he also has another trick if all that fails. If our quills do not work, he carries a powder horn, and he'll pour that right inside, mounting the powder over the breech, making a direct connection of powder to the charge inside the bore. The man who works at the back left of the gun, he actually fires our piece. He carries a couple tools. One, which is our linstock. It's a short wooden pole pointed on the end, which carries our slow match. Now, if you guys smell that sweet essence of war, well, it's just hemp rope treated in saltpeter, what we now call potassium nitrate, black powder, wine spirits, and it's a combination that will burn very slow. Yet it burns hot enough, over 300 degrees. What we need to actually fire black powder. Now you notice the men behind the gun, they carry their haversacks. These are big leather bags that bring our rounds forward so we safely don't run into any sparks as our ammunition is being brought up to the gun. His hands, but then physically rotating the trail of the gun side to side so we can accurately aim. Now exactly how these men would use these tools and pieces of ammunition was subject for debate. In fact, the artillerymen followed the procedure to load and fire, much like a shoemaker or tailor or carpenter might learn their trade. It was all passed down from officers to one another, all by word of mouth. And by 1797, a veteran of the American Revolution, William Stevens, no relation to Ebenezer Stevens, he writes it all down. He writes a young artillerist companion, in which the preface he writes that these are the very exact motions for which he learned when he was serving during the time of the American Revolution. And whether the captains, captain lieutenants, or lieutenants of the guns would have their very own jurisdiction to modify the movements. Yet they would still break down an order and an exercise on how they load and fire their gun to both safely and efficiently go through this process. And the first thing they would hear to load is,
Man out the pieces.
and they all step to their appropriate positions on the gun, on down below. And once they're in this position, when they're ready to go ahead and load, the first thing they need to do,
Sponge.
man in the front right brings the sponge over by his right side, in preparation to be in the ideal position.
Sponge piece.
He then orders his man to tend the vent, quite literally putting his thumb right on top of the vent, creating a vacuum-tight seal. Then our piece of sponge, inserted all the way down to the breech, turned around 3 times, pulling it on out. Now listen for that vacuum-tight seal. That pulls any of the oxygen out. Fire can't burn without oxygen, safely ensuring that there's no charge inside. Now we must
Handle cartridge.
the cartridge is brought forward at the man of the haversack, gives it to the man of the front left, who then places it to the man with his ladle. He puts it in his ladle, cutting the charge open with a penknife. He'll be ordered to
Charge cartridge.
cartridge is inserted all the way down to the breech. He turns the ladle 180 degrees, dropping it down to the bottom. He'll pull the ladle on out. He'll reach into a shot locker for a wad. Then he grabs his shot. Then he grabs another wad and we're ready to.
Ram cartridge.
Everything's packed on down to the breech. And with it all firmly seated against the breech, we're ready to.
Charge.
He'll take out his pick, create a hole inside the cartridge that's seated at the breech. If it's not seated, he can ram it down once more, making sure it's packed all the way down there. Now imagine in this process you have your sergeants and the corporals of the gun overseeing the whole process to ensure that that cartridge is always rammed and all the steps are going in a fluid motion so these men can do it together safely yet still efficiently. Now while the piece is being primed, the man behind steps on in. He's going to aim the gun. He places his 2 thumbnails together. And I want you, my friends, take your 2 thumbnails, place them together. So thumb to thumb. And it creates a natural curvature inside. And close one of your eyes and look through that little hole in between your thumbs. That's what these gunners are using to actually sight in on their targets. And they can look side to side, picking out individual targets. If he has to adjust the gun, he can do that very easily. When he's satisfied, we're given the command to...
Fire.
Setting off our charge like that. Now this can be done by not only 1 gun, but 2 guns, or several around various fortifications. And what they just went through was their practice. That exercise is broken down by steps, so that when they're practicing and not under enemy fire, they can learn all the movements. They do it so much it creates the discipline that allows them to hear the one order, woo! They go through all this same process. Notice how they fire, then add 1 more step. They add the worm. That's to say that small little turn iron bit to pull any of the embers out. Notice too how in this process when they load, they go no faster than they would have in exercise. In fact, iron guns like these are designed for slow, deliberate, well-calculated fire over a long period of time. Imagine by July 2nd of 1777, American forces would pull in from Mount Hope, merely almost cut off. And at that time, the Americans would fill out to their fortifications. Imagine down to our north and east, the Jersey Redoubt, sitting right on the water. Nearly 2/3 the size of the fort, fit up with 2 18-pounders, screaming up the lake at the British fleet. Out to our west, a half-mile, was the Great Redoubt, an earthen fortification mounted with 4s and 6-pounders fired away. It would remain firing from July 2nd all the way through the early morning hours of July 6th.
Fire!
And these guns weren't out in open fields, but secured inside redoubts and fortifications made of earthen walls. And when these men are defending the ground here at Ticonderoga, July 4th, July 5th, 1777, what's that famous document that's written just a year before? Declaration of Independence. So that Declaration of Independence, written a year before, yet these men are here fighting a year later. Which is quite ironic, because does that piece of paper give you your freedom?
No.
Absolutely not. Instead, it's those words placed on a page that creates unity amongst an army of men of different races, different backgrounds, and different colonies. It unites these men. It energizes them. Take good old American ingenuity, take old cannons, refit them into service, make a sound defense on the ground of Ticonderoga.